and website grand opening by elbranstalk platform Thursday, 13 November 2025. And first of all, let us pray and praise the Almighty God because of His blessing and mercy. We can come together without any obstacle here with healthy condition and happy situation. Secondly, salawat and salam always be given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thirdly, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Alfa Rizal, and I have the honor of serving as the master of ceremony for today's webinar. I also would like to greet our Excellency Professor Dr. Nasaruddin Umar MA as the Grand Imam of Istiqlal Mosque. Our Honorable Professor Dr. Fadli Lukman, MA, as a distinguished academic and the current director of higher education. Our respectable Dr. Abdul Muid Nawawi as the chair of study postgraduate program in Quran and Tafsir studies of PT IKI University Indonesia. And our respectable Professor Dr. Johanna as a professor of Islamic studies and the history of Islam at the Albert Ludwig University Freiburg, Germany. Assalamualaikum, Prof. Johanna.
Salam, hello.
We are very happy to have you here, Mr. Johanna. So, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our webinar, let me announce the housekeeping rules via Zoom. Number one, kindly mute your microphones unless invited to speak. And number two, use the chat features for the questions during the Q&A session. Number three, this webinar will be recorded for the documentation purposes. So dear audiences, elbranstalk is a non-profit academic community dedicated to the critical and multidisciplinary development of Quranic and Islamic studies. It also to accommodate activities of Quran and Tafsir studies in the context of democratizing ideas and knowledge in the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia. The webinar brings together academics, researchers, scholars, and practitioners to discuss Quranic studies under the title Media Transformations from Manuscript to Print and Beyond. So let's open our agenda today by reciting Basmalah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Next, we'll have a detailed presentation about the Elbranting program. Let us now dive into the key features and significance of the Elbranting program that will be delivered by Elbranstock team. To Elbranstock team, the time is yours.
Aku dengar ya? Suara saya terdengar? Is my voice clear? Cek cek. Assalamualaikum, aman ya? Like ya, Assalamualaikum. Good night, Prof. Johanna, Pak Fadli Lukman. Please let me presenting in bahasa. Ya, Kron, sama aku share screen dulu ya. Ya, baik. Mungkin singkat saja ya. eh ya, akhirnya kita grand launching tentang Elbranting Plus. Sebelumnya udah pernah soft launching, jadi mungkin ini akan singkat aja. Perkenalan tentang Elbranstock itu apa? Ya, teman-teman bisa cek di website atau Instagram kita ya. Kita singkat aja ini. Tadi ya udah dikenalin juga sama MC kita. Ini supervisor kita. Tim yang udah kita kerjakan, kita udah pernah undang Prof. Munzir Yunus, Karim Bawar, Feras Hamzah, Pak Gabriel dari LPNK juga seperti host kita malam ini. Terus kita juga udah pernah ngundang Pak Abdullah Said, Pak Imran El Badawi, dan lain-lain. Ini ada beberapa apa namanya nih, testimoni ya, tapi berbahasa Indonesia. Kita cepetin aja. Ya intinya banyak, alhamdulillah ya, banyak yang terbantu dengan adanya komunitas ini dan membangkitkan ide-ide baru. Kira-kira seperti itu dalam penelitian Quranic Studies ya utamanya. Ya, singkatnya kita itu The Coolest Quran and Tafsir Community. Ya, terus apa yang baru? Ya, tentu apa website ya. Teman-teman mungkin udah pernah main-main ke situ. Kalau belum, eh, silahkan main-main ke ini elbranstalk.com. Nah, di situ juga kita sudah punya apa Elbro Things istilahnya. Elbro Things ini kayak Ibi Tafsir atau studi tafsir dan teman-teman artinya itu kayak kolom lah untuk menulis. Bedanya apa sama Ibi Tafsir atau studi tafsir? Bedanya satu aja sih bedanya. Bedanya di Elbro Things ini kita menerima tulisan-tulisan dari orang-orang yang nggak mau ditahu namanya. Jadi nickname is permitted. Jadi boleh pakai nama samaran kayak kayak si ini siapa Christoph Luxemburg. Ini nggak tahu nih orangnya siapa ini, tapi terkenal bukunya diteliti di mana-mana. Oke lanjut, itu yang pertama ya nih eh aturan-aturan menulis bisa dicek di website. Ini tulisan-tulisan yang sudah terbit. Terus ya kita ada tiga kategori, empat kategori atau empat apa ya teks ya. Pertama Quranic Studies, Tafsir Studies, Tematik dan Book Review. Nah ini sama testimoni lagi. Nah L-Branding Plus. Kita ada tiga program baru, Language Course, eh, Close Reading, sama Feynman Brand. Pertama kita ke Language Course. Ya seperti bahasanya ya, kita kita kursus bahasa. Jadi yang sudah berjalan itu ada empat bahasa, English Arab tentu saja, dan Syriak, Aramaik, dan Farsi. Syriak Aramaik ini satu ya. Jadi tujuannya itu untuk supaya kita bisa akses bahasa-bahasa dengan apa literatur aslinya gitu. Jadi kita nggak baca terjemahan, apalagi terjemahan yang sudah dua kali diterjemahkan dari bahasa Jerman ke bahasa Inggris, terus bahasa Indonesia. Jadi berapa kali itu berubah bahasanya. Oke, ini yang sudah berjalan ya, dokumentasi ringkas. Farsi sudah, Syriak udah, Arabik juga, sama English. Mentornya insya Allah ini ya, oke lah ya. Dari apa dari luar negeri. Yang Farsi sama Syriak dari luar negeri, Edinburgh juga satu orang sama dari Al-Hikam satu. Ya, ini yang ready empat bahasa. Available soon. Ya, insya Allah ya kita lagi nyari siapa ya? Mentor Hebrew sama Jerman, Turki, Aramek udah ada. Nah, ini juga kita banyak menerima apa ya? Masukan-masukan atau kegelisahan-kegelisahan. Jadi kita juga ada close reading. Close reading itu ya sebagaimana namanya kita mencoba lebih dekat, lebih dalam, dan lebih intens dengan literatur-literatur Babon. Jadi ini rencananya kelas lanjutan dari kelas bahasa. Karena mayoritas bisanya bahasa Arab English, jadi kita literaturnya Arab English dulu. Kalau sudah bisa bahasa Farsi, kita coba nyentuh literatur berbahasa Farsi atau Syriak. Ini yang udah jalan ada dua, Ibnu Taimiyah dan Hermeneutik sama Mas Alif Jabal Kurdi sama Mas Fahri Afif. Dua-duanya dari UIN Bandung. Ini dua label. Ini apa ini? Oh ini yang saya tadi maksud keluhan-keluhan ya. Banyak yang minta saran dan lain-lain atau bimbingan. Karena itu kita juga mengadakan Find Membran. Find Membran ya kayak namanya. Kalau Find My iPhone biasanya. Tapi kita nyarinya Membran atau mentor dari Elbran. Ya ini bedanya ketemu one on one ya. Jadi kalau yang tadi itu bentuknya kayak kelas-kelas. Nah, jadi ada satu guru banyak murid. Ini satu orang satu. Jadi bisa untuk apa saja, bisa untuk bimbingan tesis mungkin. Ya kita ngerti lah ya. Eh, dosen pembimbing di kampus itu eh, sibuk. Jadi kita coba carikan alternatif lain yang untuk nemenin teman-teman. ini beberapa mentor yang eh, sudah beraliansi, beraliansi apa aja beraliansi dari kita. Ya ada Mbak Azka yang jadi host kita nanti, terus ada suaminya dan teman-teman yang lain ini. Ada Mas Egi, ada Mas Nanda, Kafa, Ulum, Iva, Rosyad, sama Fauzi. Ya, mungkin itu aja ya. Jadi ini kita masih buka ya, masih bisa nerima. Tapi ya gitu, sudah ada kelas, sudah ada kelas yang sudah jalan 2 pertemuan, ada yang masih 1 pertemuan. Jadi kalau mau masuk di tengah-tengah ini boleh aja. Terima kasih. Saya kembalikan ke apa ya, ke MC. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the elbranstalk team and well, audience. We step to the next agenda. It is my great honor to invite Dr. Philosophy Fadli Lukman MU to deliver the keynote speech and launch the elbranstalk website. For the Dr. Fadli Lukman, time and screens are yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
Can
warahmatullahi
everybody hear
wabarakatuh.
my voices clearly?
Very clear.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi washabihi ajma'in. Good afternoon, Johanna. Good evening for everybody here, and probably I don't know where you come from. All this, it is a very packed Zoom room and 120 people, so it just reflect the success of elbranstalk platform. Have been doing, you've been doing very good so far. I follow your Instagram account and everything, and I cannot be more proud. I'm speaking here on behalf of Pak Sahiron because he suddenly have something to do, and one of my colleague, Mbak Ipa, contacted me if I could speak on his behalf, and of course, it's a great honor for me. First of all, because Pak Sahiron is my 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 teacher. Also, I will be speaking before Professor Johanna P, which is also my supervisor during my PhD in Freiburg. And it's long time not seeing you, Professor Johanna Pink. I don't know. Probably the last time we see each other is in Freiburg, and after that we just meet a few times on Zoom. And actually, the last time we have Zoom meetings also like quite a while. And this meeting reminds me that I have a deadline for the submission of my entry for Encyclopedia of the Quran to you next week. The committee told me that I have to talk about the specific topic in the current seminar. It is about media and how we see the development of the media related to tafsir. And actually, I don't have something prepared specifically for this. Even what I can say for now is like uh, today the discussion about media in tafsir is growing. If you search, if you browse internet, Google Scholars or any scholarship search platform in Indonesia, there are tons of research by students, by lecturers, by anybody speak about tafsir in social media, in internet, in TikTok, in YouTube, in everywhere. And it just says that how the enthusiasm for this particular topic is growing, and it's growing and growing because, of course, all of these media things always gives us new things to think about, and it brings the scholarship further and further. And what I can say about this is in order to be able to speak about this, we should widen our perspective about scripture and about the Quran, because we tend to see the Quran and tafsir as the source of law, let's say, or the intellectual side of the interpretation of the Quran. And when you are dealing with media, with the transformation of media from manuscript to another kind of media. What changed actually is the media, then how it affect the intellectual side. So you cannot just talk about the intellectual side per se, and you should really make the media as a analytical term and analytical variables to be able to speak about it. And we should really think about how scripture is perceived by the communities, how they respect scriptures, not just the text, but also the orality and how we can think with, for example, Wilfred Smith theory of relationship, how the scriptures become scriptures because there are people who scripturizing the text. So there is a parable of text and also a parable of people who consider it as a text. And the change of media should be viewed within this perspective. And that's also true. We should also widen our perspective about tafsir, not just the intellectual side of tafsir, not just the legal aspect of it, not just the rhetorical perspective. But because when we see tafsir, we open, let's say, At-Tabari, and we open tafsir Jalalain, it's so different. And it's also different when you open tafsir in social media. And I can recall at least two articles, two writings from Professor Johanna Ping that you should consider about this topic. First is Forms Follow Function in Journal of Quranic Studies, where she speaks about the different layout of translation and what it means to the readership and what it means to the idea that the translator put into the translation, from the interlinear translation into the tabular translation and glossary translation. And then in the modern time, we also see the combination of the gloss translation and also interlinear translation. All of these differences of form conveys difference of functions. And it's not about the intellectual, the controversy, but how the tafsir and translation speaks to the people, speak to the audience. And this is what we think about when we speak about media and tafsir. And another, of course, her monograph, Quranic Interpretation Today, one of the chapters speak about media. And there are a few more, I guess. There is also an article about this in Handbook of Quranic Studies in Oxford, edited by Abdul Halim and Mustafa Shah, and a few more. And what I see from the research about media and tafsir, mostly in our environment in WIN and probably WIN Sunan Kalijaga and probably other WIN in Indonesia, when you speak about media, the logic that most students use is just the logic of the media, but forget the logic of tafsir tradition. And it brings imbalanced perspective, seeing probably comparing the tafsir and news in newspaper. It's not a comparable text, but the analysis is conducted as if tafsir is comparable or the same characteristic of nature with newspapers. And it is because most of the students speak about media with media theories, but forget the nature of tafsir itself. And the analysis becomes unbalanced. And this is what I'm calling you. If you are looking for discussion about media and tafsir, you should widen your perspective about media and about tafsir and the Quran, and it will brings you to interesting dynamic of research, I guess. I think that's all that I can provide to open a talk to Professor Johanna Ping. She will explore more on the topic, and I'm looking forward to it. And I should not forget that I'm here also requested to officially announce or launched the website of elbranstalk that we have that the committee must showed us. And actually, I myself also opened the website earlier, and it was nice. And one of the aspect that I like from elbranstalk is the artistic element of the content. It's really refreshing to see, and also, of course, the substance as well. And no one does. Of course, all the project like the study of language is really a very progressive initiative. I call every student who would like to study more about Quranic studies and want to speak at the general level. You should know more languages. I myself should learn more Persian, learn Syriac probably at some time in the future. And it is a good initiative. Much respect to elbranstalk. And congratulations for the launching of the website. Please, anybody, you can visit the website. You can contribute your article or your writings there, and hopefully it will grow and will contribute very much to the development of Quranic scholarship in Indonesia and in general. Thank you very much. I will return the Zoom to the MC, Mas Al Fakhrizal, and please enjoy. Please listen to the speech by Professor Johanna. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Dr. Fadli Lukman, for the keynote speech. And ladies and gentlemen, we have to come to the next agenda for our meeting, which is to hear the speech from our lecturer today, Professor Dr. Johanna Fing. The webinar will be hosted by Azka Inayatul Sahara as the ambassador of the Lajnah Pentasihan Mushaf Al-Quran in promoting the Quran reading and literacy program. For the Azka Inayatul Zahra, the time and screen are yours.
Okay, thank you very much for our MC today. Actually, I cannot unmute myself because the host is not allowing, but thank you very much also for the host. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, everyone. And good afternoon from we are going to have a special session to indicate the beginning of the website elbranstalk, as previous member of elbranstalk also presented before. We are happy that we will have a session about media transformations from manuscript to print and beyond. And our speaker today is Professor Johanna Ping, and she is a professor of Islamic Studies and History of Islam at the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg. And her research interests include modern and contemporary Quranic exegesis, Quran translations, the status of non-Muslims in Muslim-majority countries, and contemporary Islamic thought. Actually, I also found that our topic today is the third chapter of her book, which is entitled Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today, Media, Genealogies, and Interpretive Communities. And Professor Johanna Ping is now the president of International Quranic Studies Association and the principal investigator of the GloQur, or the Global Quran Project, the project which is funded by the European Research Council, or ERC, under the European Union's Horizon in 2020, and it is aimed to specifically scrutinize the Quranic translations across the world and how the Muslims assess it as the medium of manifesting their faiths. And without any further ado, let's welcome our speaker tonight, Professor Johanna P. Hopefully you are still here.
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'm sorry, I couldn't find you in my screen. Yeah. You have 2 minutes and the screen is yours, please.
Okay, I hope I have 20 minutes and not 2 minutes because I prepared for 20 minutes. So let me share my screen. Do you see this? Does it work?
Yeah, it
Okay.
works very well. Yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. And so I'm going to talk about how media has transformed Quranic exegesis from the start of print through the internet age, and basically in 3 ways. The first one is the availability of certain Quranic commentaries and how it changed with alongside media transformation. The second is the way in which the reading and reception of tafsir changes through media transformation. And the third will be how the content of and the style of engaging with the Quran changes when different media occur. So regarding the first aspect, every change to a new medium is also a threshold in the sense that, for example, when print culture emerged, you had a vast manuscript heritage. There were hundreds of thousands of tafsirs available as manuscripts, mostly in Arabic, but also in all kinds of other languages. And for people in the 20th and 21st century to have access to these works, like for 99.99% of the people, it is a requirement that these tafsir works were printed at some time. But this involves a huge effort. As you can see here, you have a manuscript of the Quranic commentary by Ibn Kathir, and you have a modern Arabic edition. It has 8 volumes. So somebody has to find the manuscripts, typeset the entire text and print it. This is expensive, it's time consuming, and it just wasn't done for most of the tafsirs that existed. So this is a study by Samuel Ross, which I can really recommend on this topic, published in 2 parts in the Journal of Quranic Studies. He tried to find from manuscript catalogs the number and identity of Arabic tafsirs that were available as manuscripts. And you can see this is the gray bars in the diagram. And then the white and kind of striped bars shows the number of tafsirs that were actually discussed in important articles that give an overview of the tafsir tradition. So you can see the vast majority of the historically existing tafsir works were not really noticed by scholars, let alone by the general public, because they were not printed mostly. And this is all the more true for tafsir works that were written from the 15th century onwards, because there's generally, I'm going to come back to this, a perception that the earlier works are more important, more authoritative, and so on. Now, one good case study of this is indeed the Quranic commentary by Ibn Kathir, which is probably, these are pictures that I took in Islamic bookshops in Paris, for example, but basically you can find the same picture no matter where you go. Maybe not in Iran, but in Sunni countries anyway. And if you ask people like which Quranic commentary should I read, which is the most important, chances are very high that people will say Ibn Kathir. And this is actually a new development, because until the 19th century, the Quranic commentary by Ibn Kathir, yes, it was around, it was kind of respected, but it was not very popular. There are not a lot of manuscripts. And then what happened is that like a certain movement that we later came to call Salafi started rediscovering the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah. And alongside Ibn Taymiyyah, they started looking at the students of Ibn Taymiyyah, including Ibn Kathir and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. And so more and more Salafi publishers started looking for manuscripts of these works and trying to print them. And Rashid Rida printed the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir in, I think, 1927 with funding from the Al Saud in Saudi Arabia. And this became very popular. It was not the first tafsir that was printed, but it was probably the first that was printed, at least in the Arab world, in a manner that was accessible to readers. And I'm going to come back to it. Then the next threshold is the internet, of course, because, I mean, let's be honest, how many of us will go to a library and look into a book of tafsir when we can just go to a website like this one, Al-Bahith Al-Qurani or atafsir.com, or we have lots of apps on cell phones, and we can just Google it, and then we have a usually very large selection of tafsir works. You can see here on Al-Bahith Al-Qurani, you have Tabari, you have Siddiq Hassan Khan, you have Shawkani, you have like works by the King Fahd complex, you have Al-Qurtubi, you have all kinds of tafsir. So this is so much more convenient than going to a library and or buying like a 12-volume book. I mean, people do buy these books, but very often they buy them just to put them on a bookshelf and boast like of having all these Islamic books. It doesn't necessarily mean they will read all the 12 volumes. So yes, this is simply what's happening. This is another threshold, and it's worth thinking about what kind of works actually make it across this threshold. Which kind of tafsir do we consider important today? And this is something that Ahmad Ash-Shamsi has explored in his very important book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, in 2020, I think, where he shows how editors, especially in the Arab world, he hasn't looked at India. I think we should also look at India because India is very important. But I think the same thing would be true for India if we looked at it. So he shows how editors in the Arab world started rediscovering all these manuscripts, partly because they were looking for authoritative early works. Like they said, okay, I'm like, for example, why do I call myself an Ash'ari theologian? And I have never actually read the works of Al-Ash'ari. I have only read the works of Ash'ari theologians who wrote commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. And I have never actually read the works of Al-Ash'ari. And if I try to find them in a library, I cannot even find them. So this is what happened in the field of tafsir as well. For example, At-Tabari was identified as one of these early works that were important, and his tafsir was printed in 1905, for example. And there's generally this idea of single author who's speaking with a single voice, and he's an authority. So this is the work we should read. But this is actually not how the tafsir tradition functioned until this point. For example, a lot of tafsirs were written in the form of hashiyas. In the background, you actually see a modern printed work in Javanese, Al-Ibriz. And this is kind of still retaining this kind of layout, even though it's probably it goes back to a single author. But what we very often had traditionally is something like this, like lots of commentary and maybe layers of commentary. Like you have the Quran, then you have a commentary on the Quran, and then you have a hashia on the commentary, then you have glosses by other people on the hashia, and so on. When these works were printed, very often what happened is this. So this is an entirely linear text, and it invites readers to read it in a linear fashion, and they get the impression that this is just one author speaking in one voice in a certain order. And this actually is an interesting case because it's the tafsir by Siddiq Hassan Khan from India. He was an Ahl Hadith member. He was very rich because he married a woman who was like the head of one of these princely states in India, and she was super wealthy. So he took all that money and he used it to print Shawkani, Ibn Kathir, Ibn Taymiyyah, and so on. And he also wrote his own tafsir. But actually, if you read this tafsir, you will find that 90% of the text is identical to the tafsir of Shawkani. And then he has some paragraphs in between where he has his own words. So if this had been written in a manuscript form, it would probably be presented as a hashia on Shawkani. But because it is printed in such a fashion, people don't recognize it as a hashia. And I think nobody has actually stated this because nobody has really studied it, or at least people who have studied it haven't recognized all the content from Shawkani. I don't know, but anyway, so it's an entirely different perception of what a tafsir is actually about and what it's doing. And also another case, I think, is Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, a very famous Salafi from Damascus. He passed away in 1914, and relatively shortly before he passed away, he left a huge tafsir in manuscript form. And then for many decades, it wasn't printed until some people from Indonesia came to visit al-Qasimi's son and said, "We have heard your father is so famous, blah, blah, blah. We have heard that he has written a tafsir. Can we read this tafsir?" And then the sons made an effort to find money and to find a publisher and so on. And it was a huge work. And again, it is presented like the picture on the right, like just a linear text, when if you read it, you get the impression that he was actually copying and pasting all kinds of different content. Like, oh, for example, I found an article in Al-Manar about this verse, and by the way, Ibn Taymiyyah says this, and I found a reference to this term in a book on Arabic geography. And so maybe, I don't know, I've never managed to find out where the manuscript is stored, but I imagine if we were to find the manuscript, we would find that it's actually more like the picture on the left. Like he wrote something, and then 3 years later, he found some other information and he added it and so on. And this is lost. Then another thing that happened, especially with print culture, is that tafsir works, which were mostly meant for other scholars, were increasingly presented as guidebooks to the guidance of the Quran for ordinary Muslims. And again, I'm coming back to the example of Ibn Kathir simply because it's so pervasive. You have it in French, you have it in Indonesian, you have it in all kinds of languages. And usually, very often, these editions are abridged editions. So it's not the complete Ibn Tafsir, it's like a shortened version to make it easier for readers. And usually, the main claims of these editions is tashih. So it's corrected and authenticated, especially the hadith, tahdhib, which means like kind of made better by removing stuff that's maybe not entirely all right, correct from a Salafi point of view. So the irony is that many of these publishers are Salafi, but they publish Ibn Kathir because they think it's the Salafi tafsir. But at the same time, he's not quite Salafi enough for them. So on the left, for example, you see a French edition that says they have authenticated all the hadith based on the work of Nasr ad-Din al-Albani, who is obviously, for them, he's an even better Salafi than Ibn Kathir. And then what I am actually getting at in this context, in the context of media, is taysir. So it's made easy. And what they mean by this is something like this. So on the right, you have the manuscript of Ibn Kathir, and it's impossible to read unless you are really a scholar and have some training. I mean, there's not even verse numbers. So if you want to find like what Quranic verse is he actually commenting on, you have to be Hafidha, you have to know the entire Quran, and then maybe you can find out by looking at the text. But it's not highlighted. There are no paragraphs. You don't know when something ends and something new starts. And on the left, you see a modern English edition from Saudi Arabia, and it's like it has headers, it has paragraphs, it has page headers, it has all these things that help readers to find their way. And also, they present this tafsir as a very structured work. So you have these headers, you know exactly what's happening in this paragraph and what's the topic of the next paragraph. Even though this was maybe not at all the way in which Ibn Kathir imagined his work. We don't know, we cannot ask him. And then again, this changes when we come to the age of smartphones, where I would argue, compared to books, they invite a very atomistic reading. And I have in the header, I have the term affordances, and this means, like this is a term that is used in archaeology, for example, or in the history of art. It means if you look at an object, it can tell you how it was meant to be used. Simply, for example, it has a handle, so you you know that you meant to take it in your hand, something like this. And websites or smartphone apps, they tell you how they are meant to be used. And usually they guide you to individual verses, and then they give you the interpretation of these verses. And this is also simply because the screen is too small. And you can swipe, of course, and read the entire thing, but it's more likely that you will use this to look up actually an individual verse. And not so much like a book, which is more like from its makeup, it's more inviting you to actually read it completely, even though I think in the case of tafsir, most people don't do that either. But at least if you look into it, you are aware that you're just looking at a very small part of the discussion. So, and then another issue is mass media tafsir, and you probably all know this person. It's just an example to show that mass media, whether it's journals, I think it started really with the Tafsir al-Manar, but also something like Tafhim al-Quran by Abu al al-Maududi, or Fi Dhilal al-Quran by Sayyid Qutb. All these works started actually as newspaper tafsir. And then at a later point, you have TV tafsir. And as Fadli said before, it's important to be aware of this, because these are not meant to serve the same purpose as the academic scholarly tafsir. To a certain extent, it's entertainment. Like, these people write it because they want readers to be interested. So they have to tell anecdotes, they have to tell stories. Maybe they switch from one topic to another. It's not this clearly and logically structured, maybe, but it's more entertaining than the classical tafsir. And yeah, the entire way of looking at the Quran is shaped by this. And then we have the internet. And here I would say this is interesting, because it doesn't only shape how we read tafsir, but it also shapes how tafsir is being produced, because in a way, the internet is a very democratic medium. Anyone can very easily start a blog, for example. It's not difficult to have a website. It's even easier to use Instagram, for example. So you have millions and millions and millions of Muslims who do this. They write a blog, or they start an Instagram channel. And very often they will not call this tafsir, of course, because they are aware that tafsir is kind of a scholarly discipline and it has requirements, and maybe they do not fulfill these requirements. They will often call it tadabbur, or reflections. Like on the left, this Instagram channel is called Her Tadabbur. On the right, this is a blog, it's called Reflections. So very often it's people who frame their engagement with the Quran as individual reflections, so nobody can attack them for, doing tafsir without having the qualification. But sometimes they end up publishing a book with all their reflections or whatever. So there can also be switches between these media. And what can also happen, like in the case of Sayyid Qutb, I mean, he didn't call his work tafsir. He called it Fi Dhilal al-Quran. And I think he very much meant to present it as reflections on the Quran. But today people just call it a tafsir because he covered the entire Quran, and it's like the canonical arrangement. You can find his commentary on individual verses. So it's just being treated like a tafsir. You will find it on tafsir websites and so on. So this can happen. It doesn't need to happen. But still, this individual way of looking at the Quran also shapes the way in which the Quran is interpreted. And just to give you a very brief example, this is a verse that has been the subject of a huge controversy in Indonesia. As you, again, probably all know, it was the controversy around Ahok, and Fadli Luqman has also written a lot about this. So in the question in Quran Al-Ma'idah 51 is, what does the term awliya mean? So do not take the Jews and the Christians as awliya. And in the Indonesian context, the controversy was over the question whether it means pemimpin, leaders. So it was interpreted or contested in a political context. Interestingly, there's a blog post in German that interprets it in a quite different way. And you can see it even from the header. The question here is asked by a Turkish-German Muslim, and he asks, may Muslims take Jews and Christians as friends? And then he starts telling a story from his life. He talks about primary school. He talks about the multinational group of friends he had, because his parents had immigrated to Germany from Turkey as labor migrants. Like most of the Turks in Germany are the descendants of labor migrants. And there were also labor migrants from a lot of other countries. So he lived in an industrial town, and they had Italians, they had Spanish, they had Portuguese. They were all working in the car factories, basically, in this town. And so he really describes like the scenes from his life, how they were his best friends, and especially in Italian. And he protected him from some Germans who always wanted to beat him up. And he invited him to his wedding, blah, 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 and so on. And then an elderly Turkish acquaintance of his parents at some point came to visit, and he said, "You may not be friends with these people, for the Quran says, do not take the Jews and Christians as friends." So this is based on a common Turkish translation, because in many Turkish Quran translations, the term awliya is actually translated as friends, which is more common actually than the Indonesian leader thing, if you like do a cross-language comparison. Anyway, I'm not going to go into his arguments. Of course, it's a long blog post where he tells the entire story of how he started thinking about this verse and started trying to find an interpretation that would allow him to be friends with non-Muslims. Because they were his friends, So it's very much based on everyday experience. Then we have other people like Khalid Abul Fadl, who is an actual scholar. He has a website where he discusses Quran An-Nisa 34, like the question whether a husband is allowed to beat his wife. And then he has always all these reflections about his personal view of God, where he says we search for God in the sense of beauty. So God is beauty, and everything that God revealed is also must be beautiful by definition. And how can the beautiful demand of us something that I feel is utterly ugly? It's not possible. And he calls this also a conscientious pause. Like I read something in the Quran that repels me, and this causes me to pause and think about whether this actually means what I think it means. And then we also have message boards, forums where people are invited to discuss. So this is just, I will not go into it for reasons of time, but this is from a Salafi message board where, for example, a Turkish professor came and asked the question again about An-Nisa 34, and he said that there were some modernist colleagues in Turkish universities, and they said that the verb used in this verse, wadribuhunna, daraba, actually doesn't mean to beat. And he's very doubtful of this new interpretation, and he looks for support for his traditional interpretation in which it is actually allowed for husbands to hit or beat their wives. And he gets all kinds of answers by people who affirm him, who confirm his opinion, who say, yeah, don't listen to these innovators. They do bid'ah. It's like, of course, daraba means to beat, and all the tafsir works say this, and they are just trying to invent a new Islam, etc., etc. So what we also have, of course, is this effect of an echo chamber, like like-minded people having an opportunity to meet each other and to confirm each other that their view is correct and only their view is correct, and so on. So yeah, these are just some of the points I wanted to make in relation to media transformation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Johanna Pink, for your very great presentation. And please allow me to have some minutes to like make a summary in bahasa Indonesia to the audiences. Ya, teman-teman semua, untuk singkat saja, presentasi beliau itu mengenai bagaimana transformasi media itu berubah seiring berjalannya waktu, dan ini mengubah juga bagaimana Quran itu dipresentasikan lewat media-media yang berbeda-beda. Awalnya itu di manuskrip itu bisa kita lihat di awal tadi bagaimana banyak karya tafsir yang tidak terekspos bahkan oleh kalangan akademisi sendiri karena berbagai keterbatasan, kemudian beralih ke era ketika banyak Salafi yang mempopulerkan karya Ibnu Katsir, tafsir Ibnu Katsir. Kemudian bagaimana ketika era internet itu tafsir mana yang seharusnya dipelajari itu mulai bermunculan diskusinya. Kemudian bagaimana ketika tafsir tersebut berubah genrenya, di mana hasyiyahnya itu mulai hilang dan hanya meninggalkan teks-teks yang sejajar saja. Kemudian muncul lagi Salafi yang menggembor-gemborkan tafsir-tafsir Ibnu Katsir meskipun ada ironi dalam hal tersebut. Kemudian bagaimana sekarang sudah ada perkembangan tafsir-tafsir yang muncul di aplikasi, kemudian di website, bahkan juga di tayangan TV atau di YouTube. Seperti itu secara umumnya. And it is time for the question and answer. And for dear audiences, you are very encouraged to have some question to our esteemed speaker tonight. And please raise your hand on the Zoom if you have any question, or you can type the question on the question box in the Zoom. Please, you are very welcome to ask anything about our topic. It looks like everyone has understood. Okay. Yeah.
Assalamualaikum.
Please, okay. Please, Pak Ali Tantowi. Dipersilakan.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to ask. Can you hear my voice?
Yeah, your voice is very clear.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask about the recent development in Saudi Arabia because as far as I'm concerned that Saudi Salafi have a new direction in studying Quran. They try to form or to to elaborate the elements of Quranic guidance in tafsir. So they try to to design a theoretical framework which is called Ilmul Hidayat Al-Quraniyah, the science of Quranic guidance. So they try to separate Quranic guidance from tafsir. So they think by doing tadabbur, they can extract of elements in Quran. So they only focus on Quranic guidance. And then as far as I'm concerned, this kind of project was very successful because they have held about 3 conferences about Quranic guidance, and then they also publish encyclopedia of Quranic guidance. So how far do you think that this kind of trend will remain? Because they try to connect this kind of project into Saudi Vision 2030. What do you think about this? Will this kind of trend attract many Muslim all over the world, or it is just only for Salafis? Is the question clear?
Yes. So I haven't looked into this kind of project deeply because in the last few years I have mostly worked on Quran translations. What I can say is that, obviously Islam is very political in Saudi Arabia, and is for a long time all kinds of Islamic discourse and Islamic text production has been based on a political agenda. And for a long time, this agenda has actually been Salafi Wahhabi. So one central institution was the King Fahd complex for the printing of the glorious Quran, and they have done all these Quran translations. For example, they also have an Indonesian translation, which is a kind of redacted version of the of Al-Quran and Terjemahnya by the Indonesian Ministry of Religious Affairs, but with like Salafi footnotes. And in the last few years, or basically since the new Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman got more power, they are trying to get rid of this Wahhabi element, kind of, because they have realized that it's bad for their image. Also in the context of Daesh, of the Islamic State, they have seen that it's dangerous, because a lot of people will take these teachings seriously, and then they actually will want to do jihad. Like, there were these teenagers in Saudi Arabia who killed their parents because their parents didn't want to allow them to go to Syria. And then they said, oh, I've read a fatwa by Ibn Taymiyyah, and he said, you know, I'm allowed to kill my parents because they are kafirun. Like, okay, things like these. So this is a bit like what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now. And my preliminary suspicion would be that this Hidayah project is kind of an attempt to get away from this hardcore Wahhabi thing. And also the King Fahd complex, for example, they are receiving a lot less funding. They have taken many of their translations from their website, and I know from some of the translators who published with them that they keep being told, yes, we are revising them, we will publish them, inshallah. But so far it isn't happening. So there seem to be some things happening politically, but like specifics about this project, I cannot tell you. I would have to look into it.
Okay, is there any response again from Pak Ali Tantowi for the answer from Prof. Johanna? You are still muted. Okay. Thank you very much. And for the next question, please, Pak Fahri Afif.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Aska. Thanks for your outstanding presentation, Professor Johanna. My name is Fahri Afif from UIN Sunan Gunung Jati, Bandung. So I would like to ask about your book that recently you have discussed in this presentation. What I have identified that the main argument of your book, especially in chapter 3, is that the media is the determining factor for the formation of tafsir, because no interpretation of the Quran can exert influence without the media through which it is transmitted, whether oral, written, visual, or digital. So media should not be understood merely as a channels of communication, but like forces that actively shape the character, tone, and content of exegetical messages. So shifts in medium from manuscript to print and from print to digital have transformed the style of interpretation, the composition of audiences, and the nature of exegetical authority itself. This shifting also marked the shifting of exegetical authority in tafsir production, where you said that transformation of media is not merely a matter of technological change, but also of distribution of exegetical authority. So I have actually 3 questions. Hopefully, Professor Johanna can answer all of those my questions. The first about concept of media and interpretation. Does your analysis imply that earlier manuscript-based tafsir was also mediated and therefore never purely textual? How does this challenge the notion of pre-modern exegetical authenticity? The first. So the second about the redistribution of authority. You call in your book that this phenomenon is democratization of tafsir, but also an epistemic shift from authority-centered exegesis to participatory community-based interpretation. So about redistribution of exegetical authority from the ulama to lay interpreters through digital media, but does this really constitute a loss of authority, or rather a pluralization of it within new hierarchies of influence like algorithms, visibility, or sponsorship? And I think the last question about can we still talk as a scholars student, professor of tafsir and Quranic studies about tafsir as a scholarly genre in a digital environment where authorship is diffuse and intertextual. Maybe that's my questions, Professor Johanna.
Yes, thank you for these really interesting questions. So first of all, yes, of course, manuscript tafsir is also mediated. We know that a lot of these tafsirs emerged in a teaching context. Sometimes they were written down by students of the person who was doing the tafsir. Even like, for example, Tafsir al-Manar is also, it claims to be based on the lectures of Muhammad Abdu. But basically what we have is Rashid Rida's presentation of these lectures and then all the commentary by Rashid Rida. So actually, we do not know what happened, what Muhammad Abdu actually said in these lectures. We simply don't know. And the same is true for all the like pre-modern works of tafsir, where we do have to think about teaching contexts and what kind of teaching. Like, for example, it's possible that some tafsirs were deliberately meant to be taught as a commentary on some other work of tafsir. But this is diffused sometimes in the way it is presented by in a manuscript, sometimes not. And it's often very hard to tell because, I mean, we don't always have all the information, but yes, it's definitely something we should always think about. The redistribution of authority, loss of authority, pluralization, I mean, all of this happens, and I would also, I wouldn't make any generalizations because in the end, you have to look at the individual case and see what's happening there. For example, democratization. When I say like the internet implies democratization, this is first of all meant in terms of authorship, like anyone can write anything in the internet. This doesn't guarantee that people will read it. So I think there's still a huge imbalance. Like some people get a lot of attention and some people write stuff, but they get no attention at all. There are all kinds of things play a role, like education, your status, for example, as part of the ulama, but gender also. I've recently written something about female Quran translators and how few of them there are and how hard it is for them to claim any exegetical authority. And very often they are actually trying to actively say, no, I'm not an exegetical authority at all. I just do language or something. Like, yeah, and men, I mean, you find men who are electrical engineers by training or something, and they don't have this issue. They can just put out a Quran translation and lots of people will be like, oh yeah, fantastic. So also again, depending on the language, the country, and so on. So we definitely have a shift of authority. And it's like in the media economy, besides the traditional aspects of authority, like being a part of the ulama, funding, for example, plays a role, but also simply your personality. Are you a media personality? Can you present information in a way that people will find interesting and appealing or not? So what happens is that some ulama write things that nobody is interested in, and some people who are not ulama will actually become media stars. But then some ulama will also become media stars. So really you have to look at the individual case. And finally, tafsir as a scholarly genre, it depends, of course, how you define it. Like, what do you include? I called my book Muslim Quranic Interpretation because I didn't want to put tafsir in the title, because I wanted to have the liberty to look at all kinds of Quranic interpretation that might not normally be considered tafsir, but maybe tadabbur or whatever. So if you have, I think tafsir as a scholarly genre still persists. I would say, for example, that Tafsir al-Misbah by Quraysh Shihab is quite scholarly tafsir in the sense that he cites different Quranic commentaries and so on. but interpretation becomes, becomes more diverse, and also this notion of authorship. Maybe this notion of authorship is a 19th century idea. I think in medieval scholarship, like for example, we have Tafsir Baydawi, and then it's so obviously like based on Zamakhshari, but then trying to make Zamakhshari non-Mu'tazili. So in what sense is it Baydawi? Yes and no. So you could have all these discussions, but I think pre-modern exegetes were not so bothered by these discussions as people became from the 19th century onwards, when we had all these ideas about individual authorship.
Thank you very much, Prof. Johanna. And is there any further comments, Pak Fahri, about the response? Okay, thank you very much. And then for the next question, I saw previously Pak Duha raised his hands, but apparently now he lowered his hands again. Okay, Pak Duha, please, yeah.
Hello, Johanna.
Hi, Doha, good to see you.
It's very good to see you, and thank you for the very interesting, thought-provoking presentations. It's always nice listening to your presentation, and we learned a lot. I have 3 questions. I'm so sorry this is not connected to the previous question, so it changes the vibe a little bit. And also, like, the 3 questions I have are of different vibes, so please bear with me. The first one is about the concept of tadabbur. I've been wondering how long has this concept of tadabbur been intervening or entering the world of tafsir production, and how long has it been appearing in the title or the branding of one tafsir? So simply the history of tadabbur in tafsir production. And the second and the third one is are about the manuscript tradition. I am always wondering about the Moroccan or probably like West African mushaf tradition that has like different rasm than the very famous one. And it has like 1 dot for qaf and no dot for fa or something like that. It has survived manuscript and print tradition. How is it doing in this era of internet? And if that kind of rasm tradition has kind of influence on their tafsir discourse? Do they have like the distinct tafsir discourse because they have different rasam or the same? And if they have like they are developing something distinct and interesting in the internet era. And the last one is about the digitization process. This is because I am now working on manuscript and I am familiar with some digitization process, and in different field, like in the field of fiqh and also like aqidah, I think, or probably like tasawwuf, the digitization process projects have bring to light some works that are otherwise forgotten from the history. So in the field of tafsir, have these projects brought into light some new tafsirs or tafsirs that were written but always forgotten, and now it is coming into light. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. So tadabbur, I'm not sure. You should probably ask Lynn, who has been working on tadabbur. My impression is that it's a relatively recent phenomenon, maybe since the 2000s. Also, I did a quick search for books that have tadabbur in the title, and I couldn't really find, at least by quick search, anything before 2000. And so I've looked a bit more when I did my project on Quran translations at this genre of reflections on the Quran. So depending on the language, you have different terms for this. But again, this is a fairly recent thing, I think. It's also something that tends to give women more agency because it's not formal tafsir. So, okay, women might not be actual scholars, but of course they can have like their, thoughts on things and so on. This is, yeah. So, I mean, the phenomenon itself might have a longer history, of course, but I still think it's very much tied to like modern subjectivity, like the idea that a person could have a personal relationship with the Quran. When this happened in the pre-modern period, it mostly happened with Sufi masters who had like tafsir ishari, like their personal inspiration from God or something. But tadabbur isn't making this claim. So to do tadabbur, you don't have to be a Sufi master who has developed like this super high degree of closeness to God or something. Anyone can do it, basically. So there's a difference, I think. So the North African tradition, that's a very complex topic. Because, yeah, first of all, I think the function with Faf, this is just a matter of the style of writing Arabic, like Nasr and Nastaligh and so on. And then there's one style in the Maghreb. It's not commonly used anymore. Then you have the Qira'at, and there's a difference here because in the Maghreb and West Africa, the Qira'ah by Warsh is most common, Warsh and Nafi', whereas most of the other countries today have the Qira'ah by Hafs and Asim. And this is very interesting. Here we can see that print culture also has brought another wave of standardization. There's actually no religious reason why Hafs and Asim should be the best Qira'ah. It just happened for some reason, maybe because it was tied to the manuscript culture of empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and so on. This is my suspicion. And this has several consequences. For example, we have a lot of pre-modern tafsirs that actually are based on a different reading, like Ibn Kathir or some, not this Ibn Kathir, another Ibn Kathir. Like, and then you have a modern printed version of this tafsir, and suddenly it uses the qira'ah of Hafs, and you don't even understand what the exeget is discussing here. So this is one thing that happened, and also in Quran translation. So there can be some small differences in content, or sometimes the difference is a bit bigger. For example, in one verse it says like Hafs says the angels are Indallah, so they are with God, and Warsh says they are Ibadullah, they are the servants of God. So this is a difference in meaning, and it is reflected in Quran translations. And I can see that in recent years there's a bit of a movement to revive this Moroccan West African tradition, maybe for patriotic reasons or something. There's one French Quran translation that you can actually buy in two versions, Warsh and Hafs, and not only the text of the Quran, the Mus'haf is different, but also the translation is different. So this is an interesting project, and there's also a kind of very strange movement founded by a convert to Islam, the Murabitun movement. This guy was called Ian Dulles, and he called himself Abdul Qadir as-Sufi or something. And they are very much focused on reviving the Andalusi and Maghrebi tradition. And for them, this also means that the tafsir of Qurtubi is particularly important, because to them, Al-Qurtubi reflects the Andalusi tradition. Yeah, and digitization, does it bring forth new works? Maybe. But I think, interestingly, so far, so in the last 20 years or so, we've had a lot of projects to edit manuscript tafsirs, and mostly they've been printed as books, is my impression. So especially those who have been edited in the Arab world. And this is another aspect, I didn't have time to mention it, but you could think that books are actually obsolete because websites, apps, and so on are so much more convenient. But books have this huge prestige, and so many people would still prefer to publish a book than to put their content on a website. And I think this is also very often true for tafsir editions. This might change, but yeah. I mean, and I'm not talking about websites that just offer like images of manuscripts. We do have that, of course, like a lot of manuscript collections who are just trying to publish images of their manuscripts, which is super helpful, but it's not the same in terms of accessibility as an edition, of course.
Thank you very much. Paluha, do you want to respond again?
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much, Johanna, and thank you, Aska.
Okay, thank you. And please, Mbak Bila, you can raise your question.
Okay, so when we talk about, do you hear my voice clearly?
Yeah, your voice is very clear.
Okay, when we talk about the genre of tafsir, do we really have strictly follow the qualification? Like it should be with a canonical text, or it should be written by authoritative scholars and so on? Because tafsir today develops through visual and narrative, and to differentiate between tafsir and other words, should we require the qualification here? Okay, that's all.
Okay, yeah. So I don't really think it's my role as a researcher to tell people what they should do. So if I talk about tafsir, I'm using it as an analytical term, and then depending on what question I'm studying, I say like, okay, I understand tafsir as being this thing, and not other things. But this isn't a normative claim in the sense that I say people shouldn't do it or they shouldn't call it tafsir or whatever. It's simply a pragmatic decision. So I'm more interested in observing what Muslims do because it tells me something about how they perceive this genre, how they perceive authority, the tradition of religious learning. And so we have a conventional definition of tafsir that basically says it has a certain structure. So in terms of classifying it as a literary genre, the structure is you have the canonical text of the Quran, and then the exegete goes through this text verse by verse or segment by segment and gives a commentary and draws on earlier interpretations normally, and also on other sources such as hadith or philology or law, things like these. And yes, I mean, there is a discourse about what qualifications you have to have in order to be able to do this. Like you have to be fluent in Arabic. And then sometimes there used to be conferences in London at SOAS on the Quran. And I presented at these conferences several times. And every time there were Arabs in the audience who were getting up afterwards and telling me that only Arabs are allowed to translate the Quran, interpret the Quran, etc., because nobody else knows sufficient Arabic. And I was like, yeah, okay, first of all, unfortunately for you, 80% of Muslims are not Arabs and they are just doing it, whether you want them to or not. And second, I don't know, the average Egyptian is also not that great at classical Arabic, sorry. Yeah, so they also have to study it if they want to be good at it. So anyway, we have this discourse, and I'm really more interested in observing this, how this plays out, what people kind of, what kind of claims they raise, what kind of criticism they get. Like in Indonesia, you had the whole controversy about Habib Yassin when he wrote his Quran translation. And all the ulama were like, no, you can't do that. And a lot of this was, I mean, of course, they tried to find points of criticism about his translation. But in actual fact, I mean, you can criticize every translation, of course, because every Quran translation makes some decisions that might not be the entire meaning of a verse. But he didn't, and from my point of view, he didn't make any outrageous, like completely heretical decisions or whatever. It was really mostly about who he was as a person, and his lack of knowledge of Arabic and all these kinds of things. So people trying to make the case that this person is simply not allowed to to present the meaning of the Quran to others. And this happened in Indonesia, but for example, in English-speaking countries, you have these kind of people, like people with no Islamic training, translating the Quran all the time. And because it's a completely different context, it's diaspora Muslims, and maybe it's harder to find Muslims who actually are fluent in English or whatever language we're talking about. You don't have this kind of discussion as often. So this is more like the kind of questions that I'm interested in.
Thank you very much, Prof. Do you have anything to confirm again, Bila?
Okay, no.
Okay, thank you very much. And Prof, we have 3 questions here on the chat box. The first, what do you think about Indonesian website tafsil.id, which has digitalized scientific Quranic exegesis? Is there any disadvantages from this kind of website?
Okay, so I have to admit I don't know the website. I'm not keeping track of every website that
Yeah.
offers some tafsir. So if does scientific Quranic exegesis mean like tafsir ilmi, or can somebody tell me? Or what does it mean? Yes, okay. I mean, anyone can have an opinion on, again, I don't think it's my job to tell people like this is good, this is bad, you should do this, you should do that. It's up to everyone to decide whether they feel that this is an advantage. Obviously, this idea of reading the Quran in the light of modern science is an idea that has come up maybe in the beginning, late 19th, early 20th century. In the beginning, mostly, I think, in a defensive manner, like people like Muhammad Abdu and Sayyid Ahmed Khan, they were saying like, okay, we want to show to Christians that the Quran is a rational book and it doesn't contain anything that contradicts modern scientific knowledge. So they tried to, like famously, Muhammad Abdu tried to interpret the jinn as microbes that cause diseases. So it doesn't sound like superstition or something. And later then, from the 1960s, 70s onwards, we have this trend that very much originated in Saudi Arabia, but also in Pakistan to a certain extent, where the idea is that the Quran contains all the knowledge in the world and lots of like facts that the Prophet couldn't have known and that nobody in the 7th century AD knew about. And like, you know, you could write encyclopedias about all these kinds of things. And there's also been a lot of criticism of this approach for a number of reasons. First of all, it's very eclectic. Like you pick something in the Quran and you say, okay, this confirms X scientific truth. But then you have some other statement in the Quran that does not confirm a scientific truth. And there you suddenly say, oh no, it has to be read metaphorically or something. So yeah. And what happens if scientific knowledge changes? Does it suddenly invalidate the Quran? And also when we have some statements about, I don't know, the moon is splitting or the earth is tearing apart, is it really meant as a textbook of physics or geology or something? I mean, really, or is it supposed to give some image of apocalyptic events? And it's in the end, it's a discussion about the I'jaz al-Quran, like what does make the Quran so inimitable, so miraculous? Is it the Quran style, rhetoric, or is it like the fact that it contains historical and scientific facts that you can just look up and say, oh, wow, it confirms this, it confirms that, how miraculous. And the proponents of the first opinion would say, like, actually, it's the rhetoric, it's the emotional power of these images. And if you start analyzing them as some kind of physics, chemistry, geology lesson, and so on, it just loses all this power. But people who are in favor of it very often have this idea that this is the way to convince people that Islam is the true religion. I've talked to a lot of people in Europe, especially, who thought like this is the way of doing dawah. And to be honest, I very much doubt that. I don't know a lot of people who are actually, I mean, who don't already believe in Islam, who will be convinced by this kind of logic. But still. I mean, if people read this kind of website and feel it benefits them personally, who am I to say you shouldn't do this?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. And the next question, what is your opinion on the changes in interpretation over time? Does this mean that the Quran itself changes due to the continuous development of interpretations?
I mean, actually, the Quran as a text is remarkably stable. I mean, we now have some research on early Quran manuscripts that shows that we really have a very consistent text very early onward. We have some different qira'at and so on, but compared to the Bible, for example, or to a lot of other texts from this long ago, it's a relatively stable text, and this Arabic text is not changing. I don't see people who want to change it. At least it's not an opinion I think that gets a lot of attention. But of course, we see a lot of people who interpret it in different ways. And I think this is just inherent to the text because and it's also, on the one hand, it's inherent to the text because the text contains many things whose meaning is not fixed and unambiguous, but open to several meanings. And this is already reflected in the classical tafsir tradition. Very often you have exegetes like at-Tabari giving different possibilities of what the verse can mean. So this is one thing, but it says something about us as humans. Because throughout the history of Islam, people who have read the Quran and interpreted the Quran have tried to achieve coherence within the Quran, but also between the Quran and their larger ideas. Like, for example, the Mu'tazila has always had a certain approach to theological questions in the Quran, like the freedom of will. And the Ash'aris have had a different position. And sometimes this position is so strong that it's actually stronger than the text of the Quran. Like, for example, you will find many Ash'aris who say, when the Quran talks about Yad Allah, Arsh Allah, whatever, it cannot mean the literal thing because my theology does not allow me this concept. So I think what's happening today with these debates about gender, for example, like does daraba mean beating? What's the status of women compared to their husband? It's no different. It's people who have a certain view of God and of the world. Like on the slide I showed you about Khalid Abul Fadl, who says God is beauty. And my idea of beauty does not allow me to just accept that the Quran tells a husband to beat his wife, because that would be so repulsive. So I have to pause and think about another thing. And this is not really different from Ash'aris saying, okay, the Quran says Al Arsh istawa, but this cannot really mean that God is a physical being who is above some kind of physical throne. So I have to think again and find some other solution. So I think these things are happening, and this is simply due to the fact that, well, we have the Quran. I think it's a stable text, but we are humans and we bring our own understanding, and this will, until God speaks directly, authoritatively to everyone at once, this will keep happening, because even when there are some people who claim to receive wahi from God, this will not be accepted by everyone else and so on. So yeah. So no, I think personally, I think it's not, the Quran is not changing, but interpretations are changing. They have always been changing. And this is unavoidable and therefore also not a problem per se. This doesn't mean you have to accept every interpretation, of course. You can still disagree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last, about the emergence of AI as new epistemic agent. It could be new domain where contestation arises between human and machine. Is this AI invention merely an assistant in understanding the Quran, or is it beginning to take part in the very construction of Quranic interpretation itself? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, so far, I don't think that AI can actually interpret the Quran, because it's not Excellent. I mean, what you mean when we talk about AI in this sense is usually ChatGPT and stuff like this. There are, of course, many different types of AI, but in this case, it's probably ChatGPT. And ChatGPT is a large language model, and large language models are not actually designed to interpret anything. They are designed to produce text that looks like an interpretation. So they take all the interpretations they can find and basically do a good and plausible sounding text on this. They produce a good and plausible sounding text on this basis, which in the end might contain a new interpretation, but more likely it's just a digest of most common interpretations of the Quran in the internet or something. But this is becoming, absolutely, it's becoming an issue. So in my research on Quran translations, I have already found several Quran translations that have clearly been produced by machine translation or by AI. It's very easy to do this. And I experimented with it by myself. I told AI, can you give me a Quran translation in Nigerian English? And then can you give me a fictional biography and a name for for a translator who could have written this translation? And the result is totally convincing. And you can just put it on the cover of your translation, the name and the biography and anything. And who on earth will be able to prove that this person does not exist somewhere in Nigeria or something? Most people won't even make that effort. So they will just buy it because it's for sale. And at the moment, I think the versions that you can find are relatively clumsily done by some Chinese company that just wants to make money from, I don't know, naive Amazon customers or something. But I think they will get much better very soon. And very soon we will have this question of authorship on an entirely new level, because it will be impossible to say who actually wrote something. And maybe this will actually require us to go back to archives and find the physical copies of things to make sure that this actually exists and it's not just an AI invention or something. Because AI will probably even be able to produce pictures of plausible looking manuscripts and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a problem, but what can we do?
There's one last question, but probably this is not really related to our topic.
No, and I also have no expertise on it, so
Oh,
I would
okay.
rather not comment on Michael Kuipers.
Okay. So we would just skip this question. And
I lost your voice.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I think we have reached the end of our event this evening. And for the closing remarks, please, Prof, for about 1-2 minutes. This is really 2 minutes. Yeah, please.
So who? Should I say something?
Yeah, for the closing remarks. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So I didn't know I had to do closing remarks. But anyway, yes. Thank you so much. That these were all very like really great questions and made me think about a lot of things. And above all, the best of luck to the website of elbranstalk. I think it's a great project, and I wish you a lot of success and many users and a lot of learning to emerge from this website, and blessings on all of you. And I hope to be able to travel to Indonesia soon and maybe meet some of you in person.
Yeah, we hope so, Prof. It would be very grateful for us. Okay, thank you very much, and dear audiences. This is the end of our event, and I'd like to return the time and the screen again for the MC. Thank you very much, Prof, for the very great presentation. And yeah, I would like to give to the MC again, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aska, and thank you very much for Prof. Johanna Ping for incredible explanation and insight. And before we officially close today's session, we kindly invite all speakers, moderators, and participants to turn on their camera for a brief group photo. It will only take a moment and will be part of our official documentation. Please prepare to turn on your camera in the next 10 seconds. Okay, in the counting, 3, 2, 1, cheese. Then 3, 2, 1, cheese. Once again, 3, 2, 1, and cheese. Okay, thank you very much, guys, ladies and gentlemen. As our agenda ran well without any obstacle, we extend our deepest appreciation to all incredible speakers and participants, especially for the keynote speaker, Prof. Fadli Lukman and Prof. Johanna Ping for the lecture, and Dr. Muid Nawawi, and also Azka Inayatuzara for the moderator. Extend our deepest appreciation to the institution and the community of Islamic and Quranic studies for their valuable collaboration. And please accept my sincere apologies for any mistakes or shortcomings during my role as Master of Ceremony. Let's close by reciting Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.